What is initiation? What is culture? What skills and tools do we need during a time of transition? This is Darren Silver, and welcome to The Return. Welcome, everyone, to the Return podcast. I am personally very excited for this interview with Tom Nixon, author of Work with Source. We were just talking a little bit. I first came upon his work probably 7 years ago or so, and his mentor, Peter Koenig's work about 7 years ago. So super excited. Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Darren. Yeah, I'm curious what we're going to get into today.
Yeah. Thanks for being here. I'm curious for the listeners if you could just give a high level overview of what source work is.
Yeah, certainly. So, in a nutshell, what source work is all about is how we make ideas a reality in the world. So, it's about all of our creative projects from the simple things that we might carry out solo through to building businesses or non-profits or social movements. And it's the dynamics around, how stuff actually gets done, how things either get stuck or get into a state of flow. And so I lean very heavily on the work of my really great friend and mentor who you mentioned, Peter Koenig, who's based in Switzerland. He, I guess, unpacked the principles of source that we're going to be talking about today. And I've very much been someone who's been putting them to practice at work in the world with clients and in my own initiatives for many years now, and wrote the book about it as well. So it's about how do ideas come to life, and probably one of the central ideas to it, and sometimes this is the most controversial thing that Peter said, but is actually sort of the first principle, is that if we look at an initiative like a company, a non-profit, or a party, whatever it may be, we find exactly one single human individual in a role that he called the role of source. And that person has a unique connection and sense of what the thing is that's coming into the world. So what its edges are, so what's in and what's out, what's the next step for the initiative as a whole. And that can be very controversial, particularly in the world that's rightly challenging notions around patriarchy and toxic forms of hierarchy, to say that actually there is one individual who's sort of at the top of the hierarchy, but we're talking about a hierarchy that operates in a very different way to the systems that people might imagine. But we can get further into that. But that's what it's about in a nutshell. But we can unpack this a bit more depending which way your curiosity goes.
Yeah. I love source work so much. I feel like there's 1,000 questions coursing through me. And let's just go here. How does source work address power and power dynamics in a healthy way? And how does it differ from, let's just say, other ways of leadership or organizational structure?
Yeah, this is a great topic to get into. It's so important right now.
Awesome.
So at a really high level, what we're always trying to do with source work is move away from what we might call a power over paradigm. And that's for the reasons that many people bristle at the idea of hierarchy or one person being in a special role in an initiative, because there's this fear and this idea that that person fundamentally has power over other people. And that's caused a lot of the problems that we see in the world today. And frankly, it just reduces the creative potential of people as well. If they've got power over them, the best people will find ways to leave and do something better elsewhere. And the rest of the people will probably just stay there under this system of oppression, and they're frankly not going to do their best work. So with source work, it's a way of starting to understand how we can move to a power with paradigm. And
Mhm,
by doing that, that actually starts not from the perspective, oh, of which individual is the source of this particular initiative, but looking at all of us, all humans, as sources. So all humans have an innate capability to be creative. And in smaller
mhm.
or larger ways, we all do this all the time. You know, I might be thirsty, so I go and source a cup of tea from downstairs. And that's obviously a very trivial example, all the way up to starting a project that might involve dozens, hundreds, thousands of people over many years. But we're all creative, and we're all able to have a sense of what is meaningful to me. What is my vision? What do I want to create in the world? What's my unique ethics as well, which is never going to be completely identical to anyone else's, no matter how well aligned we feel we are. So it starts with each individual seeing themselves as a source, and recognizing that when we work together, even if I join your initiative, I don't make myself fundamentally subservient to you. I still feel equally powerful as a fellow human being. But what we do is we recognize that within the context of a particular collaboration, like in the context of this podcast, I've stepped into your field, and this is your initiative, and I'm happy to step in because it's fun to have these conversations, and it gives us something hopefully useful that we can share with other people. So I recognize that I've stepped into your thing, but I don't do that in such a way where I diminish myself. I do it because stepping in here is a great place for me to play, and it's actually a part of me doing what's mine to do in the world, which is hopefully sharing some useful ideas to people. So that's where it starts. Yeah, seeing all of us equally as sources, but then in a particular context, we recognize the creative hierarchy of which individual is the source, and then who stepped in to help them realize that vision. And providing we don't do things like, for example, projecting our own power and externalizing that on the source, which is quite common. So if you think of an initiative that has an iconic, charismatic founder, people will project a lot onto them to say, well, they're so powerful, they're so inspirational. So ideally, we don't want to do that. We want to have our own well of power and inspiration that we act from, and not diminish ourselves. But this is particularly important as to why the inner work aspect of working with source is so vital. So it's not just about a creative process to make an idea happen in the world. There's an inner journey we have to go on so that we can be fully wide open to create wildly and maybe radically in the world, and to not diminish ourselves, to externalize parts of ourselves, such as our power, onto other things or other people. So that's how I would see it.
Yeah. So a lot of my work is doing wilderness-based rites of passage or vision
Yeah.
quest, or they go by many names. Vision fast, vision quest, wilderness vigil. Um, and the kind of underlying premise of that work is people go out to discover or come into contact with their vision.
Mm,
And another way to look at it in source language is they go out there to come into contact of that which they desire to be the source of,
yeah.
on a small scale and on a big scale.
Mm,
So the language just really, really resonates with me, about source. I'm curious, because some of my work is like, how do people? Vision Quest has responded to this question that I've had. How do people get into contact with their vision?
yeah.
Um, I'm curious for you, like, what are the qualities of a source, whether it's a global source, a source of a company, or
Yeah.
subsources or specific sources? Yeah, what are the qualities to pay attention to?
Yeah. So there's probably two sides to this. So the first side of it is when you find yourself in the role of source and you recognize that actually, yeah, I started this thing. Because the role of source comes into being in an emergent way. It's not like a position where you can recruit someone into it and decide who it is or have an election to decide who it is. It's an emergent role that emerges at the moment that someone takes some sort of risk or vulnerable step where there's something on the line for them to start turning an idea, a vision, into reality. So we're all capable of doing that, and we all do that at many times in our lives. But then once you recognize yourself in that role, the question is like, what am I supposed to actually be doing? So in terms of the qualities that are needed, to simplify this, I've sort of put it into what I call the source compass. So if you imagine the north-south axis is a polarity between being top down and bottom up. So there is an inherently top down and hierarchical role for the source to play, because they have to hold the integrity and the edge of the initiative. Otherwise, it becomes all things to all people, or it becomes corrupted and loses its integrity. And so there is this really top-down element to being a source. And for some people, that comes really naturally, and for others, they have to work quite hard on that. Particularly people who, for understandable reasons, have a real allergy to hierarchy and top-down systems. But a good source will develop this quality in themselves to be able to be decisive, to be able to hold a line when it needs to be held. But then the other side of that polarity, so if that's the north, then the south is being bottom up. And that's about being able to step back and say, I don't know. I need to create space here for other people to step into my field. Sometimes we call them specific sources because they become the source for a more specific part of the whole. So to be able to get out of the way and let people take the initiative for the many things that need to be done to realize the overall vision, they need to be able to harness the collective intelligence of the group as well. So I think it's, one of the sort of the drums that I beat is dispelling this myth of the hero visionary, who just knows the future and always has all the answers. Actually, the best sources are ones who can say, I don't know, and go into a state of listening. And one of the things that you can listen to is the collective intelligence of the other people, of the group of people that you're working with, to help you start to fathom what's the next step, what's needed to wrestle with what the edge of the initiative really needs to be. So good sources are able to work in that polarity. And again, some sources have the opposite problem. So they're very good at being decentralized. They're like, I don't want to be anyone special. I want to make this all about all of us. I want this highly collective, participatory endeavor. And I just want to be a participant in it, just like everyone else. And there's some good in that because they're not just making it all about them, but they're actually ignoring that as the source of it. They do have a different special role to everyone else. And that will probably become more and more apparent over time, particularly as and when it enters a decline or a crisis or that person leaves. So for those people who more naturally orient towards collective processes, they need to integrate the top-down part and be able to be decisive, and to get help from others around them to help them hold that really well. So it doesn't have to be this very lonely solo job, in spite of the fact you have a different role from everybody else in the initiative. You can get help from people to say, like, am I overbalanced into top down or bottom up working, and how can I cultivate more of the opposite? So
Mhm.
that's one really important aspect. And then to sort of complete the compass metaphor on sort of the east-west axis, at one end we have the ability to sit with doubt and just not knowing. And this usually comes as a great relief to people. It certainly did to me when I learned this from Peter, when he said that the chronic state of a source, where they spend most of their time, is doubt. So this is the opposite to the hero visionary, like this, the sort of myths like Steve Jobs and other famous supposedly visionary founders, that they just know all the time. But actually, sources spend most of the time saying, I don't know exactly what the edge is, or this idea we're talking about, does this fit or is this out of scope? Or should we be going this way next or going that way next? So being in that state of doubt is the chronic state of a source. So cultivating the ability to sit in in that doubt and be able to stay grounded and not make a move that comes from a place of rush or a lack of clarity, because that will just lead to a costly or frustrating correction later. But to sit with that doubt until the clarity emerges, and this is probably one area. There are probably many, but this is probably one area where the source work dovetails with your work. And sometimes it is a moment out in nature, or in a ritual, or even just daydreaming, frankly, when
Mhm.
suddenly because you've listened enough, you've listened to the signals from inside you, you've listened to what's the signals coming externally, and now okay, the next move is we have to go here, and then you're ready to move. So that's the opposite side of the polarity from doubt, is clarity, and then being able to take the next steps and actually move the initiative forward when you're clear. So good
Mhm.
sources are able to wrestle with those two polarities, and not get stuck. And it's not just finding sort of a balance or a halfway point between the two. Like sometimes you need to, radically sit with doubt, maybe for an extended period of time. And other times you might be clear and it's time to motor ahead, but then pause when you're back in doubt again. And likewise with top down and bottom up, there's a time and a place to be radically decentralized, to really call upon collective processes and for people to help sense what might be possible and to completely get out of their way as they start to realize parts of the overall vision. And there's a time to be radically top down, to say this thing's not working and we need to
Mhm.
make big moves to bring it back into integrity again. So great sources do that. So all of that is kind of one part of it. And then the other part goes back to the inner work that I mentioned briefly earlier. And so this is about cultivating the ability to adopt any sort of character or identity that might be needed at any point during the creative process. So the best sources are really flexible, and they have the ability to say, well, what kind of a character do I need to be right now to solve this problem, to take this next step? Or if something's difficult's happening and they get sort of put into a position where they suddenly find themselves, playing a character or being a victim or a failure or some kind of character that they really don't like, to be able to integrate that and accept that that's part of themselves. So we call this in our field, we call this reclamation work, because we're reclaiming access to all of these identities that we might
Hmm.
not have access to, or that we might over identify with, or that we might project outwards onto other people or objects, including money. We could get into the whole money work part of this as well. But that process of inner work is absolutely vital for sources. That's a very hard ceiling of how far you can go as a source, just by focusing on the creative outward facing process of realizing a vision. To break through that level, it requires inner work. And this practice of reclamation work is a very direct and powerful way of doing that.
Mhm. When people go out in the wilderness, I've heard this story so many times. They come back and they say, I received a vision,
Mm,
but to fulfill my vision, I then have to learn how to do this, 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 and this.
mhm.
Um, and as opposed to living that vision, all of a sudden people are learning how to be accountants.
Yeah.
That is like, and I can personally identify with that.
Mm,
Um, my role is not to be an accountant in my business, and yet not quite big enough as an organization to employ a bunch of people
mm,
to fulfill those roles. Um, and so, what's the dance? Because I feel I'm brushing up against the doubt, um,
mm,
and how doubt can be a surrendered not knowing and
mm.
actually an internal shakiness because it's not my role.
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes if we take doubt as a specific example of this. So doubts and not knowing can be very uncomfortable for some people, particularly if their upbringing or their culture praises and rewards just action and always moving ahead or always having the answer. So to be able to do that, that requires working on their identity. So I think of a founder. I think it was last year I was working on this with him. So we had to do a reclamation around not having all the ideas, because part of his identity had been built on being a guy who had great ideas. And it was true that he did have great ideas. He did have great judgment, and he was a brilliant leader in so many ways, but that could only get him so far. So doing the work to integrate the part of himself that had no clue, and to really own that and integrate that as part of himself, then allows him to integrate more of the bottom up working process. And you'll probably find even better ideas that he could have never come up with alone if he's tapping into the collective wisdom of a larger group. So that part of the work is vital.
What are the ways that you did practices in reclamation? I mean, in organizations and as leaders, it seems like edgy work, even to
Yeah,
use that word. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly is, and most of the time, I'm either doing it with the source of an initiative, so often the founder or the successor to a founder. It's really hard doing this just as kind of like sort of coaching or people development work inside companies and initiatives, because even when they're very, very progressive in their cultures, um, to go that deep and that personal is sometimes just not actually even appropriate, and it should obviously never be forced upon people or made like a mandatory training or anything like that. I mean, it wouldn't even work if it was mandated in that way. But in some ways, this is like tantric kind of work, and so doing that in the workplace and in the organizations where people are employed is risky. Um, I think there's going to be more of it happening in the times to come, because I'm starting to work on it in some of the most radically progressive initiatives that are out there who are ready. But even for them, it's quite a stretch, and it's something quite new. Um, but working, yeah, with founders and the sources of initiatives, or doing it outside of work, so people step into a different environment.
Mhm.
To either say a retreat over a weekend, or have some coaching work that's feels like it's got a that feels like it's somehow separate just to their pure work role. But I think we're going to see it more and more, and it will start, yeah, in the more progressive places. But it does need to be handled with caution because of the power that it has. So, yeah,
Mhm.
certainly very, very consensual, and only when people are really ready for it and really, really want to do it. But it is a very direct route towards increasing self-awareness, because it just goes directly looking for what are the aspects of myself that I'm disassociated from, and then how do I reclaim them. And Peter Koenig has been saying more recently that he believes that most modalities of therapy and inner work, ultimately that's what they eventually get to. They get to people being broader and more flexible, more integrated with parts of themselves that they've disassociated from. And there are many modalities and ways of getting there, and the one that we use is just extremely direct, so it has a lot of power to it.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so I'm just gonna do a little bit of a recap. So source work is about, um, this is my language, receiving an inspiration and
Mm,
being able to create this out in the world.
yes, it
Yeah,
is.
and invite people into that particular vision.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
To me, that implicitly is a spiritual experience. To receive an inspiration is, um, for me, when I have those moments, it feels like I'm touching all that is holy. My
Mm.
awareness expands. I feel a sense of belonging. I feel connected to everything. Um, is that language, is spiritual language sometimes used or
Yeah.
discussed in
Yeah,
source work?
It is absolutely, and there's a few different aspects of this, and it's quite funny as well, actually, because the source work itself doesn't have a really sort of specific spiritual underpinning. So it's kind of agnostic in terms of people's spiritual beliefs. And what I found talking to people about this in many different cultures around the world, in recent years, I've done quite a lot of work in Japan, as well as
Mm.
in Europe and America and various other places. And people have really different answers to, okay, so where does it come from? If I'm the source and I'm manifesting this idea, what is the deeper source of that thing? And some people, when you ask them that question, will look up to the heavens, and it's like this download from above, or from the universe. For me personally, I almost had this feeling of that it's sort of out there, like in the atmosphere, like this sort of almost like electricity that's crackling all around us, and then sometimes it coalesces and reaches one individual. But I'm certainly not saying that's sort of correct or the only answer. That's just a way of thinking about it that seems to make sense to me. Some of the guys in Japan that I work with, who do a lot of nature-based work, working very much with nature to grow food,
Mm.
they really have more of a sort of a Mother Earth, like a Pachamama kind of view. So when they think about where the ideas come from, they look down first, and it's like it's up, it's coming from the soil and from the earth. Um, some people have the feeling that they are a conduit, like it's coming through them from somewhere else. So it's not coming from them, but through them. Others have a perspective that they, as a human, are almost like this human embodiment of something, that some unknowable spiritual force, or that the universe wants to see happen, and it's coalesced into a body that's called Tom or Darren. It's like it's chosen you, and then you've got to make it work. And the funny side of this is what Peter's always said. Is he said, I don't actually really care whether it's from the earth or from above, because where his work and my work really start is, okay, so once you recognize that you are a source, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to step into that role and hold it well, so you have a chance of seeing this vision come to life? And so, so I think, like, the work that you do around Vision Quest is really powerful. And if that creates this really meaningful experience for people, which I'm sure that it does, um, then that's great, and they're getting their source of inspiration. And in some ways, people will be debating this stuff for eternity, because it's beyond science and reason. I don't think anyone will be able to prove or disprove any particular theory of this, unless we discover we're all living in a computer simulation. um, so I think whatever works for people, but then once
Mm.
you're on the line and you've got this download or upload, whatever it might be, coming to you, what do you do with that? And that's where these practices of being able to be both top down and bottom up, and sitting with doubt, but then moving ahead when you're ready, and being able to bring other people in and to collaborate, that's what's really needed. And you alluded to that earlier, that it's not enough just to have an amazing, inspiring vision. Unless you're really ready to be a source, then it's only going to be a vision. It's not going to become reality. Um, sometimes in our community, we talk about are you radical enough? So radical, coming from the Latin radix, being about like the root of things. So are you willing to strip back the expectations of our culture and our society, and being an accountant and all the rest of it, to say, no, I've got this vision, and my job is to get it clearer, to work out what's in and what's out, and to take the next step that's needed to realize that vision. And that may or may not be being an accountant first, but if it is the true next step, that's the one you need to take, and to work through whatever fear there is, or stories from your past that are holding you back from taking that step. That's what's really needed, and that's, yeah, the inner work part of it.
Mhm. Yeah, there's this sense that source work, as an organization grows, more complexity increases.
Mm,
Um, and by complexity, I mean a series of relationships that are highly interconnected.
Yeah.
When I look at that ecologically speaking, um, more life begets more life. When
Yeah.
complexity increases, there's a lot more stability, for example. Systems deepen in a certain way, but also the source becomes more uh, obtuse or hard to define
Right.
the more complex the system gets. And I'm even thinking about agriculturally, like in permaculture principles when there's a guild where
Yeah.
the center of the guild is, let's just say it's an apple tree. And then all these other species come in to support that apple tree. But if I go to an untouched forest, there's so much complexity, I can't identify a specific source.
Yeah.
And do you feel like what I'm pointing towards?
Yeah. So the web of life itself, which is what you're really getting at, is a completely
Yeah,
decentralized system. The only sort of
yeah,
whole that you have there, the only aspect that in a way is a centralized thing is the whole, is the planet, is the biosphere itself. So there is no one source or center of the biosphere. So no one tree is in charge of a rainforest, let alone in charge of, all of life on the planet. So that is certainly true. But then when it comes to human initiatives, so when a creative process starts in in the human realm to realize an idea, it doesn't come from nowhere. So there is a point in time when the idea is not being realized, and then a source takes the initiative and they start. And so there is a center. And then as other
yeah,
people join them, so so another way you can look at this hierarchy is like a hierarchy of invitations. So I start something and then I'm like, "Hey Darren, I'm doing this thing. Do you want to come and do you want to come and take part? Because I think it could really do with your skills." And you make your own decision based on yourself as a source. You don't do it to make me happy. You do it because you think it's a great place for you to play. And then maybe further down the line, you invite people and they invite people and they invite people. And so we have this hierarchy of invitations. There is a single individual at the apex of that hierarchy. Although I prefer to draw it as a pattern of nested circles. So rather than like an upside down tree, like a corporate org chart, it's more like one big circle that represents the wholeness that the overall source is holding, and then smaller circles and sometimes circles nested within those that represent the ever more specific things. And so even in very large human initiatives, so if you think of, I don't know, you could look at a large corporation or a large nonprofit or an activist movement with many thousands of people. Two things are true at once. That first of all, exactly as you articulated really well, there is just this massive complexity, and there is a network of connections and relationships and power dynamics and all sorts of things going on. And the sort of underneath that, there is the creative hierarchy, because that thing didn't just spontaneously formed.
mm,
It had a genesis moment where it came into being. And so often this is a way to help work in complexity. So we don't deny that complexity, that it is a living, complex, adaptive system as well. But underneath it, there is a creative hierarchy. And this can really help us when we're trying to wrestle with that hierarchy, even in very large initiatives. So the source principles apply from small projects with a couple of people working on them all the way up to very large initiatives with maybe hundreds of thousands of people. So by identifying the source hierarchy, so putting on that particular pair of glasses and looking through the complex soupiness of it all to say, right, who started this thing and are they still around? And what's the source hierarchy today? Has the original source passed it to a successor or not? We can start to diagnose what's going on, and it's a very powerful way of seeing why things are either flowing or getting stuck. So some people don't like the source work because they almost find that it simplifies all of that complexity to one simple model. And that would be true if that was all we were doing. So we would never say that the source hierarchy is all there is and to deny all the rest of the complexity and nuance and things that might be going on. But it's like a layer, like a substrate underneath any human initiative. And as you tune into that, you can usually start to see very quickly why there are major problems. And then that will then point to where the interventions might be, because ultimately it will track back to the individual in the role of source for the initiative.
What are some examples of obstacles that you've seen in sources, like
Yeah.
common ones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the most common ones is a focus on money rather than the vision. So this is incredibly common, and obviously for obvious reasons in the business world, that it becomes about profit and shareholder value rather than the focus on the creative vision of what that company is actually there to on planet Earth to really do. And so that will start, if that's what the culture and the dynamic in an initiative is like, that will start with the source and their relationship with money. And so what we do is we would look at the projections that person has onto money. So what do they see money as? And if you talk to entrepreneurs, they will usually say things like, well, of course I need to make money because I want to be successful and I want to be free and I want to be secure and enabled and all of these things. So what we would need to do, the inner work for that person, would be to work on their sense of security and freedom and success so that they can start to realize that they've got access to that all the time, with and without money. And as you ease off this attachment to money because you think it's the thing that's going to give you these qualities that have always been available to you, then you can come back to the vision to say, well, what am I actually creating here in the world? What makes me come alive? What's the world asking for? Or back to whatever their vision was that came from the vision quest that maybe you led them on. So that's one of the most common. And by the way, it happens in non-profit initiatives as well. So it's not only companies, but you see non-profit initiatives where it's all about the donors and the grants and the funding, that's the thing that makes this thing work. And it's not true. What makes it work is you've got a compelling idea and vision and enough passion to keep investing yourself in that vision, to keep taking the next step. And as you're doing that, that becomes an attractive force for talent and resources and attention and money. But the money is a thing that follows. So the money follows the energy rather than creates the energy. So this is why the work that we do around people's relationship to money is such an integral part of source work. Not just because money is such an important topic, but it's unique as a human creation in that it acts like a projector screen or like a mirror for our projections, for parts of ourselves that we're externalizing. So money work is a really key one. But more generally, cultural issues. So if you've ever been in a company or a charity that's got some toxicity in the culture, certain types of behaviors that are going on there, once you know who the source is, you can see ultimately who that is coming from. So the culture isn't
Sounds
just a decentralized phenomenon. It actually tracks back to the source and their own pathologies that they need to work on. There's also the phenomenon that people like attract like, and like attract its polar opposites. So that if you've got, I don't know, a source who's a completely gung ho risk taker, for example, they're going to attract other gung ho risk takers, and they'll probably attract a bunch of ultra conservative people as well who hate risks. And then you see the clash inside the culture. And so then what you're looking to do is then work on the relationship to risk with the source, and then you can have a healthy relationship, because sometimes risk is entirely appropriate and other times being low risk and being conservative is appropriate. And so you can level up the whole of the culture by starting with the source and watch it ripple outwards. And there's been countless founders that I've coached when we talk about the problems that are going on in their culture, and then they have this moment when they realize it's all a reflection of them, even if it's indirect. And they say, yeah, but surely that bad behavior is coming from that person over there. It's like, okay, who invited them? Well, I didn't invite them. That person invited them. Or who invited them? Oh, I did. So it does track back. So it does track back to them ultimately about what they allowed in and what they have tolerated inside their field. And so there's often this quite a sort of an oh shit moment that sorts of will happen. But it's then shortly followed by an empowering feeling because they realize, oh, if this comes from me, then if I sort myself out and I deal with my own inner issues, then that will ripple out as a positive force into the culture. So that's just a couple for you.
Yeah, I may fumble through this a little bit because these are things I've been chewing on for a while.
No, go
There's
for it.
several organizations that I've been a part of and communities. It's not just initiatives that look a variety of different ways.
Mm,
And I've seen a couple different things. One is no one wants to take position of source.
yeah.
And so there's an enormous amount of consensus that happens in a kind of bogged downness
Yeah.
in the initiative with people. Um, another one is someone clearly is the source, but isn't clear on the vision.
Mm,
And the source may be, let's just say, a property owner.
mhm,
I've been in a position, gosh, many times in the past 15 years where I've been quote unquote the caretaker of
yeah.
land. I'm thinking of one experience probably a decade ago. Um, and what the landowner wanted for the land wasn't clear,
Mm,
um, or was uh, it wasn't clear enough that I felt like I could step into something.
yeah.
And so there's that. Then there's organizations or communities where people don't want to take responsibility for the source. And so what I'm getting at is where is the balance that forms that edge of the circle where there is a level of knowing in the vision and responsibility and the sense of surrender to not knowing. Like it's
Mm.
not so black and white, but I've run into both and been like, like I understand the not knowing part, but also there's so much not knowing that there's not even an edge.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is
Do
a
do
really good topic. Yeah. So let's see if we can get into it a
yeah.
little. So the first thing I say is when we think about communities, I sometimes think they're almost very crudely, there are sort of two different types of communities. There are ones that do genuinely just emerge quite organically. So just a bunch of people who happen to be in a similar place at a similar time start to form relationships and a community has formed, and that is a decentralized phenomenon. So often communities around places where people live, there's no one individual who's the source of that whole community. And then we have, of course, intentional communities where people say, hey, I'm going to set up an eco village or a co-living project somewhere, and those ones do very clearly have a source. And this is where I think the tide is starting to turn a bit, because often, in terms of their values, political beliefs, they tend to be left leaning. They're anti patriarchal, and they don't want to create a tyranny of hierarchy or an accidental patriarchy. But then what happens is they create sort of the almost the opposite tyranny, which I've sometimes called it the tyranny of the humble founder. So where you've got someone who has started a project, and through good intentions and probably an inner battle with their own ego, are trying to say, "Oh, it's not all about me. I'm not so important. It's all about all of us." And then you watch the life drain out of the thing, because then other people will then project their vision and their values onto it, and there'll be no coherence to the thing. And meanwhile, whatever the deeper thing is that that source was trying to do, because at some point they took the initiative, they took a first risk to get the thing moving. So there was something they were passionate about. But if they're not standing in that natural authorship of that, and guiding and stewarding that and guiding what needs to happen, it creates this power vacuum. And so you then start to see either power struggles emerging, because then there'll be competing visions for it, and then you see a lot of conflict, or it will just get endlessly watered down. And that's what you alluded to, this endless consensus seeking to try and please everybody. And then it doesn't really stand for anything, doesn't do anything bold, and it is constantly in workshops and group processes trying to get clear
Exactly.
actually needs the source. But what I'm starting to see more and more now, because I've been sort of, writing and working in this area for the last, 12 or 13 years, is it now? Um, there seems to be far less resistance now to source, because I think people now have enough experience of trying it the very decentralized collectivist way and seeing it not work, and seeing the accidental tyranny or missed opportunity that happens there. And then often they're ready to finally either say, look, I was the source of this thing and I have to accept that. Or they acknowledge someone else and say, look, Darren, you started this thing and we need to hear your voice. We need to hear what this impulse was from you. And then we can decide if we want to actually help you with that or not, because we're not just going to follow you like you're some cult leader that we can't say no to. We'll decide if we're in or if we're out, and we may rebel against you. So there's no guarantees, but you at least need to tell us what this party is, given that we've all been invited and we're here now. But then, yeah, I think then part of what you spoke about again alludes to this top down, bottom up dynamic, which is a real art form. Because if we have too much of the top down, of the source just saying, okay, so this, say it's, I don't know, an intentional community eco village type of initiative. If the source gets overconfident that they know exactly what every aspect of this eco village is going to be like, they're soon going to run into the limits of the creative capacity of any one individual. That obviously they don't know everything, and there'll be many things that they miss, or many great ideas that aren't going to come from them. So they have to be, yeah, willing to step back and say, what could happen on the land here, but create clear boundaries around it. So if someone comes up with an idea to say, I don't know, we want to have some random example like EV charging stations on the land, and someone might say, no, we're totally off grid. We're totally off grid. We're not doing that here. And someone else will say, yeah, but it's useful to get EVs in and out. And you could have a back and forth discussion about that. But at some point, a line needs to be created about what this thing is and what it's not, and that
Mhm.
ultimately comes from the source, but often with a lot of help to help them get clear. One thing that Peter Koenig has often said, he spent many years working with people around decentralized decision making, decentralized organizing. So, for example, people in the sociocracy world, as have I as well, and that was sort of one of the key themes in my book. But what will often happen there is, from a decentralized organizing perspective, is you would say, well, we'll have a group process to make a collective decision. So perhaps there'll be a proposal made, but ultimately the group consents to that decision to put in the EV charging points or not do it. And then when the decision's made, is they'll say, we decided together. But from a source perspective, we would say, actually, something different happened there. There was a source of that idea, and that person actually made the decision, but the group process was used to help them get clear. So to help them see problems with their idea, to maybe see if they want to actually abandon the idea if it's not a good one. And so when the decision gets made, it's not actually the group that's made it, but the source of that decision has made the decision, and the group has helped them to get clear. So it's quite a radical reframing. But I don't know what you think, but I just think it's more truthful that that's what's really going on there. But it doesn't diminish at all the importance of the group or the value of the collective intelligence that it brings.
Yeah, to me, source work is a path of freedom of expression of what wants to be birthed through someone.
Yeah,
Um, that there's something about the defining of the edges actually lends way to more freedom of what wants to move through.
yeah,
Um, I've I've always felt that with source work. It's actually, unlocking things more than it's closing things down. Um,
Yeah, exactly. That it's that when things are working well, there is this just this sense of things are flowing really, really naturally. So again, if we go back to the example about collective decision making processes, when a source
mhm,
has really listened and really gotten clear about the next step or whether a particular project should be in or whether it's out of scope, when they get clear and they communicate that, when things are working well, the consent just comes really naturally. That people say, "Well, of course we're doing that next. Why would we be doing anything else?" Like, duh. And so what you don't have is either this death by consensus thing, where it's getting watered down until eventually no one's pissed off enough to block it, and it goes through, but no one's actually truly, really energized about what's happening. Nor do you have the opposite end of the spectrum, which is that coercion or that power over, where the source or somebody who owns most of the shares or put the money in forces their way through, even if people don't like it. So yeah, so source aims to create this flowing state where people just do what makes sense and what's needed, and then the consent just comes really naturally. But that's not
mhm.
to say, and it's not realistic to expect every initiative to always have that complete harmony. And so there might be moments where someone says, okay, if this is the direction it's going, then actually I want to leave because I don't want to be part of this. And that's healthy, and people should leave. There's a whole sort of sub discussion we could have about this, about cults, because cults do have very strong sources, but there you see some of the toxic expressions of sources. So you do see that coercion and force. You see people not being allowed to leave, cutting off their families. So that's a very toxic expression of it. But sort of a healthy sources field is like a healthy cult where people stay just because they're having such a great time, and they get to be ever more themselves by being there, and they will rebel against the source, and they will call the source out if they're out of their integrity. And the source will never, as a human, put themselves above anybody else, and will say, if people are unhappy, then maybe it's me that's the problem, and I need to work on myself to resolve this. Whereas a cult leader would obviously always say, the problem's everyone else because I'm the enlightened one.
Sure. It's touching transparency in the
Hmm.
role of the source, what you're saying, especially when you bring up cults.
Mm,
Um, like, how important is it for the source to be transparent about decisions that are made,
mm,
about communication between specific sources?
mm.
So things are, I mean, how much is left implicit and how much is left explicit?
Yeah.
And I'm
So
thinking a little bit, there's a book by Erin Myers, um, and I can't remember the title. I remember the author, where she
mm,
talks about different cultures and how much is left implicit and explicit, how much is
mm,
spoken and how much isn't spoken between India and the UK, for example. Very different. So,
mm.
yeah, I'd love to hear about transparency.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, actually. And I hadn't thought about it from that aspect. And perhaps, it sounds like there's been some really good research on this. But it sounds like there's probably not one single right answer. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, about the work that I've done often in the sort of the Eurocentric world, and Europe and the US, and then in Japan. So Japan often has much more indirect communication.
Right,
Um, but
right,
source is incredibly powerful and strong there. And in many ways it connects to sort of ancient Japanese culture. So I think there are many different styles and ways of doing it. But communication of some sort is certainly important, because if the source gets clear on the direction, then others need to be aware of that. Otherwise, they can't truly help. But whether that communication is really explicit, like, oh, I'm now clear and this is the direction, whether they just start moving in that direction, and then people just naturally start to follow because it's coherent and it makes sense to them. So there are probably many ways. I feel like I don't have the final answer on that at all. But yeah, it's an interesting framing. I think one additional thing that I would say is that although being the source is an individual and centralized role, it's often through the power of their specific sources, so the others around them, that really help the initiative to come to life. And so there can be other specific sources who are great at communicating, and so it might be their job to help the source get clear and to make sure everyone else is understanding what's happening and what needs to happen next. So the source themselves doesn't have to be the one to do that. Even sources often aren't even able to put clearly into words what the vision actually even is. And
Yeah.
I've seen this many times. And again, this can be quite a relief to founders because they're like, I'm the source of this thing and I need to tell people what the vision is, and I can't even put it into words. And often they need somebody else to be a sounding board. So I do this for my clients, but it could be just a colleague that they have that can listen to their crazy ramblings about what the vision is and then keep playing it back to them. So I think what you're trying to tell us is that it's this. And they go, no, it's not quite that. It's like this. And they describe it and they go, so is it like this? And eventually they get it. And they're so grateful that someone else has helped put it into words or pictures. Um, and in language, it will only ever be an approximation of what the source feels in the whole of their being, because language is an abstraction. It's not the whole of the truth of what we feel and sense as as a human being. But to have things in language certainly helps to communicate it and to be able to get other people on board in it. But it needs the source to stay active in that process. Because if people just say, well, here's the written brief, and I think I'm following the vision or the specification, they're going to miss nuance, and they're going to miss, some of the details or maybe some of the bits that weren't communicated with the best possible words. So it's a constant process for the source to just to course correct and to apologize if they haven't been clear enough. If someone does something in good faith where they think they're following the vision but it turns out they're not, but that was actually because the source hadn't been clear, not because of anything that person had done wrong, then they might need to say sorry and go back and find ways to be clearer.
Yeah, I've wrestled with, and again, the language that I use is vision, but it's very similar to source depending on the context. Sometimes it may be someone coming off of a vision quest, and sometimes it may be working with them afterwards to help them integrate what they received. I've been resistant to people saying, "Well, can you put that in your words, Darren,
Mm,
what I'm saying?" And I'm like, No, I can only reflect back what I'm hearing."
mm,
Um, and my position on that is, if it becomes my words, then I feel too much like it's mine and not yours.
yeah.
And I'm curious if you've had that experience with working with founders, and identifying the, uh, the vision of being a source.
Yeah, absolutely. You do have to be careful with that. So you listen to them, and where possible, I do. So I have a lot of sessions with sources where if we're meeting on Zoom, I'll have the document open and I'll ask them the questions, and then I'll just type as they're talking, and then I'll play it back to them. Or sometimes they'll get stuck, and I might try and help them find the words, but you have to be really careful that you're helping them find the words. Or if I say, I think what I'm hearing is this, but then really check it with them. They don't say yes because it's what I've heard. They say yes because it's resonated with them, and they're saying yes. You've helped me find the words to articulate what's true to me. Um, so yeah, that's how I do it. Yeah.
Sure. All right. I want to talk about the succession of source, but
Mm,
first, it's coming up for me because I'm in a position where about to start a family.
mhm.
Baby will be here in couple, 3, 4, 5 months, something like that. And I'm curious. This is edgy. Um, because when I first heard of source work from this woman, Alanya, she said source work even plays out in a romantic relationship.
Yeah.
And I haven't worked with people in that way or thought about it in that way, but it's remained in my head, and it remains as I start to think about a family.
Yeah.
The creation of a
Yeah.
family. Do you work with people in that realm? Or
y-
what do you know about source work and
yeah.
family
So
dynamics?
So in my professional work, I tend to work with people who started projects and initiatives out in the world, so companies, nonprofits, movements, communities, those kinds of things. So I don't do much work with couples, but the principles really hold up in that context because an intimate relationship is an initiative. So somebody made the first move, the first vulnerable step, because they had some sort of vision, and at the beginning it might not have been very clear about, if they didn't have the whole future mapped out for them and their partner and maybe a family, but there was something there that they were sourcing, and they recruited the other person into it. And it is fascinating that when couples do look at their relationship from that perspective, because most couples work usually sees them only as equals. And we would say, yes, they are equals because they're two equally valuable human souls. We don't put one above the other as a human, but we say in the context of your relationship, one of you was the source. And was it you or was it you? And that starts to explain a lot about the dynamic that's going on. And Peter often, he's always very clear that Barbara, his partner, is the source of their relationship. And he says, she's the one that knows what needs to happen next and what's in and what's out. And he says, everything's much
Mm,
smoother for me if I just, help her to be clear and then really listen when she's speaking from a place of genuine clarity, that I listen and we go that way. And it's invariably the right thing. We don't have to make every decision by consensus. So it absolutely, I think, holds really true. And then by extension, you can even say that um, if things are potentially coming to an end, because not all relationships last forever, that's life,
uh,
is that it's the source who's the only one who can close the relationship. So they can say this is done because it's their initiative. The other one can't close it. But what they can do is the other person can leave. So they can say, I don't want to be here anymore and I'll leave it. But then it will still be open in the heart, in the soul of the source of that relationship, until they probably do their own grief work, and
mm.
and then they close it. So it has a big bearing on how things, come to an end, as well. So it can be, so it's a thing you could really reflect on with your partner to see. And do you feel like you even know? Is it clear whether you were the source or whether it's her?
Yeah, I've chewed on it. Again, it's like been in the back of my mind, and, I would have to talk with her because she's
Mm,
gonna listen to this at some point. But I would say that I'm the source.
yeah.
Um, and yet I can see other perspectives on that too. But
Yeah.
that's, you know, I've especially with a kid coming, I've had a desire to define what roles,
Mm,
um, we play for a sense of clarity. I mean, there's some obvious ones, just with a baby and biologically speaking, and there's a lot in there, and so I know I've had this desire, it's been on my mind,
mm,
to discuss the relationship and the growing family through the lens of source.
yeah. Yeah. And there is an extension to this, that the child will have one of the two of you as the source of that child. And that will be the parent
Say
that
more, what do you mean by that?
so having a child was an initiative. And so until such time as that child matures and becomes, a sovereign adult in their own right, that one of the parents is the source of that child, and that will be the parent who throughout childhood will be the one who has the sense that they know best about what this child needs and
Mm,
which way it's going, while it's still their job to help steer that child. So again, that's not the area that I work in, but I found it, a pretty powerful lens with many people that I've spoken to about themselves and their children. And so it may be that one of that you or your partner are the source of your relationship as a whole, but it could be the other one who's the source of the child. Quite often there's one of the couple who's the source of the relationship, and the other is the source of the home that they live in. So that can happen as well. So working out who's the source of what, and acknowledging yourselves and committing to be the best source that you can. So doing it in a sense, in a way of power with, of deep listening, of sitting with doubt, only moving forward when you're clear. If you show up as a good source for the things that are truly yours, and you acknowledge the source in your partner, that's a really deep, powerful way of maintaining that connection and the love over the long term.
Of course, yeah. I get really excited about this. When I think about nesting circles, which
Mm,
is a visual representation of source work, if one is the source of the relationship and the other is the source of the home, do they
mm.
nest inside each other? Is it two different maps? Is it overlapping circles like a Vesica
No, one would be
Pisces?
in the other. So the relationship itself that defines the whole field for the two people. But then within that, so we sometimes call it a sub initiative because it's one sub part of of the whole that's within that relationship is creating a home. And even smaller things like any holidays that you go on together, or any trips that you might take, or even a dinner party that you organize, each has a source. And even if you say, okay, we as a couple are inviting our friends over, it's like, yes, the invitation can certainly come from both of you, but who was the one who initiated it? And what was their vision? Was this supposed to be sort of like a high energy, kind of really fun type of a gathering, or was it supposed to be like a slow, kind of calm, chilled one? And if you can acknowledge who was the source of it and what the vision was for it, then the other one can really help them in a really loving way, can help them to have their need met and their vision realized. And you'll generally find it's a better dinner party or holiday as a result.
I love talking about this.
Yeah,
I
it's
do
quite
want to
mind-blowing aspect of it, isn't it?
say one more time.
Quite mind-blowing, this aspect of source, isn't it? Looking at
Yeah,
children and our most intimate relationships. Yeah.
yeah. I do want to talk about the succession of source, and I want to preface it with an experience. There's actually two that I know. Well, there's more than that. There's so many communities slash nonprofits slash organizations that are, let's just say, baby boomer generation that
Mm,
initiated something. They're getting into their 70s, um, and it's time for it to pass on. Um,
mm,
and and I've seen it look so many different ways. Um, from my perspective, some successfully and some not.
yeah.
And uh, I also there's a community in New York where I've for the past 3 years done a boys rite of passage program. They're an intentional community inspired from the teachings of Gurdjieff, and
Okay.
and I sometimes am like, wow, this community made it through the '60s, and
Yeah.
how did you guys do this? And I just love the community so much. And their founder, the head teacher, um, passed away, gosh, maybe in the '90s, maybe in the '80s. I don't fully know. And the community has maintained itself. That I've looked at it and been like, I can't identify a source other than the teachings or the spirit of the previous founder. And they are very much in this moment of passing it on. And
Mm,
how does this thing continue? Um, and they are, and a lot of the community members are in their 70s, and they're getting young people show up for 3 months, and they hang around, and some are committing and some are not. So generally speaking, the succession of source, and perhaps you can push off of that example.
yeah. Well, that sounds like quite an atypical case, actually. So in the event of the death of a source, things become very uncertain, and it's, there aren't a large enough number of case studies for us to have a really clear set of principles about about what happens in those cases. But what we would expect to happen is that if the source died, and they hadn't passed on the role of source to their successor, then their field would slowly be dying, and possibly over a number of years if it was strong and had some good momentum behind it. But the reason your case is interesting is this happened like 40, 50 years ago. And it seems like the community has really been maintained and been vibrant. Um, so that's interesting. So that would suggest to me that there has been a successor. And sometimes they're hiding in plain sight. So not as a super visible kind of charismatic leader, like a cult leader, but someone who is actually doing the quieter work of holding the integrity, or who even in very decentralized group situations, when they have to make decisions about, are we doing this thing or are we not doing that thing, noticing whose voice carries that extra weight, where when that person gets clear and says, yeah, that thing's in, that people naturally consent, not because they're following their charisma, but because they're following just the natural authorship for this thing. So my first hunch would be that there might well have been a succession. So I would be, exploring who it might be, even if they don't appear to have a very visible sort of leader in the more traditional sense. Or it is possible that it is dying, but it's dying very, very slowly. Because when you say that it's not necessarily been able to move with the times and attract and retain members to replace the older ones who are on their way out, it might be that it's just taking a long time. It feels so long, though, that feels unlikely to me. Usually this kind of thing
Mhm.
would play out, in a single digit number of years, that the thing would just kind of lose its way and be dying and just be a kind of a husk of its former self. But that doesn't seem to have happened in this case. Um, so, so with succession more generally, the way that it works is that there has to be a willing succession from the original source to their successor, and they have to be willing to let it go, and the successor has to be truly willing to take it. And the it that's really passed on is the deeper sense of values of the initiative. So the creative vision of what this thing is going to look like in the future and where it's going, that will always be emergent and changing over time. But the deepest values of the initiative, they can, evolve sometimes over longer time periods. But the values are the thing that create the red thread all the way back to the original founding through many, many generations, maybe even hundreds of years. So that's the thing that really gets passed on. It's when the source feels that their successor really gets the values, is ready and wants to embody them and to live them and to uphold them. That's the thing that creates the conditions for the source to pass it to them. And it does work a bit like a rite of passage. And so it's not like, it doesn't need a ritual or a ceremony, but rituals and ceremonies can really help these processes, but that's not a requirement of it. In my own research into this, I've met people where it almost happens just very naturally and in an unplanned way, where when you explain to them about a succession of sorts, they go, "Oh yeah, I remember when that happened. I remember the specific moment and where I was and what was said." And because these are like all rites of passage, these create very meaningful moments that you remember forever. And people remember that moment where something energetically was passed to them, or when they let it go. So it may be that the source did pass it on before they died. It may also be that in the sort of the vacuum left by the source dying, that something new was actually born. So even if it's in the same physical location and it's based on the same teachings, it might have actually been a new beginning. So there are quite a few possibilities of what might have happened. So with the death of a source, things are less clear. We do see situations where the source hasn't necessarily died, but has just reached a point of exhaustion where they just don't care anymore. And they ostensibly leave, but because they're the source, you can't truly leave in that way. But it's a bit like if they're holding the flaming torch for the initiative, they they sort of stub out the flame and leave it on the ground, and they walk away. These circumstances only happen if the source genuinely doesn't care what happens next. It's like, I don't care if it grows or dies. Like, I'm done and I'm out of here. And then what can happen is somebody else can come along and go, there's no source around here. They will be probably detecting consciously or unconsciously that the field is dying, but the torch can be picked up off the floor and relit, but it's a new flame. So that's a new start. So even if it's using the assets, even if it's still in the same place, using some of the same teachings, it will be a new beginning with a new source. So there's a few possibilities as to what might have happened with that particular community. But it's a very interesting case study. I'd be curious about what you discover if you put on the source pair of glasses and look at it and talk to some of those elders who've been around a long time, and see if you can get to the bottom of it and see if there is actually a source who's alive today, because that person will be critical in passing it to the next generation. Um, and one final thing to say about this is, particularly in community or collectivist-oriented initiatives, there can be this strong desire for the source to leave it and pass it to everyone. Like, I leave this to the collective,
Yep.
or as you mentioned, like, oh, it's the work now that is the source. Like, we've never seen that work over the long term. That creates an illusion of a succession, but actually it hasn't truly been passed on. So I would, yeah, try and, where you can, advise against making that mistake, which is always really tragic because it sounds so lovely, doesn't it? Oh, I started this thing, but I couldn't have done it without all of you, and now I'm leaving, and I leave it in the trusted hands of this collective, and everyone goes, yeah, that's great. And then you come back a few years later, the power struggles have started, or the dilution has started because it's not being held anymore, and either the source never passed it on at all because they tried to pass it to a group and that doesn't work, or actually what really happened was they passed it to one person, but that person isn't acknowledging themselves, and so they're taking a back seat, and colluding in this sort of false sense that it's being collectively held. So that's a common pattern that we see, and those ones take a bit of unpicking to get them back on track.
Yeah, I'm witnessing it right now with, an initiative, organization that touched my life so deeply, and the founder passed, and, succession, from my point of view, which is many degrees separate, just as a student, it's a shit show, and power
Mm,
dynamics, and confusion, and that was exactly his words, was that this is a "we" thing now.
yeah.
Um, and I think yeah, I know I cringed a little bit, even though I felt empowered, like, "Wow, I get to carry
Mm.
forth this vision in my own way," it still was like, "Ooh, I don't I see a lot of challenges with that route."
Yeah, yeah, that's right. They are painful, these ones, because it's been done with the best of intentions. And it
Yeah.
sounds so plausible as well, doesn't it? But just, Peter Koenig clarified these source principles not as a new ideology or as a new approach to collaborations and making things happen, but it was born out of observation. So the principles were just noticing what was actually going on when things were working or getting stuck. And so that's how, he arrived at them, and that's the pattern that we see, is that these successions to a collective don't stand the test of time. But if someone gathers some really good evidence that proves us wrong and helps us understand if and how that can happen, then we'd love to hear it. And then the principles would need to be updated. So it's not a fixed dogma, it's just our best understanding of how things work when they're working well. But I'd be very skeptical and see till I see some good case studies, because we've seen enough counterexamples of where it's, yeah, as you've described, where it goes really wrong. Mm.
Yeah. Well, it's what I love about source work is, how I've read it from your work, and other articles online, is it's not fixed, and it's not a dogma. It seems more like a tool and a lens.
Yeah.
And yeah. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So Tom, how can people get access to more of your work, whether it's the book, or Maptio, or working with you in some way?
Thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah, so my website is just tomnixon.co.uk. So that's a good jumping off point. But I'm on, yeah, Substack and LinkedIn are probably the most up to date places where you can find me. But the website will be there forever, so you can start there and find me and yeah, and get in touch.
wonderful. Are you doing programs or educational containers for people to learn more about source work?
Yes, so there's the CU Source program. So it's just the letters C and U, and then um, and Source. So that's online. We've just started a cohorts in March 26. So hopefully be another one later in the year. One of the things I'm really interested in doing is where I work with a source who wants to bring together a group of maybe 8 to 10 people who want to go on a learning journey of source over an extended period of say 9 months. Those are really fun. So the best way that these work is rather than me announcing the program and filling places, I work with someone who actually has a community and wants to make something happen or has a network, and we do it for them and their people. So those are really fun. So if that sparks something in someone, or maybe it's you, Darren, I don't know, and we do it for people in your community. But I call those
Yeah.
source mastery, those journeys. Yeah. So that's another
Oh,
possibility.
awesome. Awesome. Well, Tom, I want to thank you for spending the time, uh, letting us have some dialogue and me ask you a bunch of questions about source work. And um, yeah, for the listeners, this work is so powerful. I hope you felt that in the interview today. And yeah, look forward to talking to you again soon, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. And yeah, and good luck to you and to everyone watching with for your lives and for everything that you're sourcing. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks.